My name is John Spiak, and I'm the director, chief curator at Cal State Fullerton's Grand Central Arts Center located in Santa Ana, California. And I guess the first question is, how do I define social practice? And I think, that's a tough question, and it's one that's being debated a lot at conferences, from the Creative Time Summit to Open Engagement to conversations at Otis right now. I define it, I think, as Tom Finkelpearl is trying to define it right now in his new book, that it's the cooperation of individuals and recognizing that it's an artist-led process, but with the knowledge of others, so that the artist isn't complete authority on the topic, that the artist is open to the fact that other people can bring knowledge and different perspectives to a project that heighten the awareness of that project, with the results being able to transition mid-project. So there's not always a defined outcome of that project, but through the knowledge of others coming into that project, things can shift and adjust as needed.
Could you give me an example?
A good example, I would say, I think back to a project I did with Josh Green, and we were doing a series at the Arizona State University Museum when I was there called Social Studies. And we brought Josh Green in, and he had some ideas of what he wanted to do in the museum space. And so that project started with an empty gallery space within the museum, and we would have an opening reception, invite people to an opening reception with no art on the walls, just the artist in the space, and that artist would talk to people. So we had the opening reception, and Josh talked about some of the ideas he had. And then the next day he said, "Here's my request. I want two 4x8 sheets put together to make a platform that's on wheels, so I can have my desk in the space, and people will come in and talk to me, and it will be great." Well, we did that, and no one was coming in to talk to Josh because it looked like an empty gallery space and maybe an installation, being ready, prepared for the space. And it wasn't until this woman with a Canadian tour group, her name was Jessie Smith, and she was with a senior Canadian tour group, came into the space, and they were told, we have this artist in residency over here, and we have the other exhibitions over here. And all the people in the group went over to the other exhibitions, and Jessie was really interested that there was an artist working in the space, so she went into Josh. And at the time, Josh had no one was coming into this space, so he was having this kind of a little breakdown where he was IMing his wife, like, how do I make people come into this space? And they were having this conversation where she was recommending, putting up wind chimes and having furniture and carpet and paint the wall a certain color and put up a mirror and have a fish tank, and all these kind of recommendations of things that people might like to see and might invite them into the space. And so Jessie came in, and he had his laptop on the desk and his lunch there, and she thought he was painting still lifes. And so they got into a conversation about what was happening. And through that conversation, she said, "You need art on the walls." And so then Josh said, "Okay, well, I have access to the entire permanent collection. Why don't you come back? How long are you here?" She says, 3 weeks. He says, "Why don't you come back next week, and we'll go through the entire permanent collection, and you can pick the work for this specific wall." And so she did, and we recorded that process. And we installed the work the way she envisioned it. We listened to all her cues and how she was saying, "Oh, this piece matches that piece," or kind of goes with this piece in conversation. So we installed it that way, and then presented the video in the space of her selecting. And through that process, Josh, where he had these certain ideas before, all of a sudden the idea became about how decisions are made in a museum. And that's what social studies is all about, how the creative process occurs. And so he decided to let other people make the decisions throughout the entire project. So a high school group would come in, and he'd say, "What do you want to do?" And they would say, "Oh, we want to take a group shot, a group photo, like we're in spring break, and so we'll take a photo like that." And then, "Oh, we want to throw the curator up in the air." So they convinced me to kind of hoist them up in the air, and they're throwing me up in the air. And then he moved my entire office to the space so that people could see how I was making decisions. So he was really taking the social studies process to heart. The way we saw it as a museum was the reason we started the social studies process is that we felt creativity was no longer happening in the museum.
Mm-hmm.
You were seeing the end results of creativity. So a curator is sitting in an office someplace making a decision about an exhibition. An artist is in a studio someplace secluded making the work. That work is crated up, it's shipped to a museum, it sits in the loading dock, it moves to the empty gallery, we close off the gallery. The curator works with the preparator to install the show, and when it's exactly how we want the audience to see it, you're invited in to see that, which is, in a sense, the end result of all creativity. You're seeing that kind of stagnant piece. And so what Josh did was actually open that process to say, you're going to see how all decisions are made in the museum, from the curator level to preparators that are making their own artwork and how that influences them, to video artists using an artist in their own pieces, but it's that artist has no say of what he's going to do. He's just being used as an actor. To Jessie Smith, then bringing her senior tour group back and being the docent as expert of that work that she selected herself.
Great.
So that's how it changed, through that process, and it's through people that you meet and things just kind of boil up to a head, and that happens over and over and over again with these social practice projects where you meet somebody and you're like, oh wow, this person, we didn't even know this kind of job existed or this kind of connection existed, and that knowledge then informs the project, tenfold, and the project becomes stronger because of that relationship.
I am going to ask you the third question, but first of all, I have to go and get my bread out of the oven. I can smell it.
Okay.
I'm sorry. We've been speaking a bit longer than I expected. I'll be right back, John. Sorry about that.
Don't edit that out.
Okay, I won't. Question number 3 then. How do you see the field evolving?
I think it's an interesting stage right now. I think people are really starting to get a sense of what social practice is, but with variations. So, the programs taking place at PSU are a lot different than the programs taking place at Otis. Quite a bit different than the ones taking place at CCA. You see that blends. There's similarities, but there's quite a bit of differences as well about kind of political action versus community-engaged actions, and I think it's evolving that way. I think funding is evolving. You see organizations like the Irvine Foundation now writing that in, the NEA writing that into their grants, allowing a little bit more flexibility with how that process and that funding occurs. So I think that's evolving. And I think recognition of the practice is now being understood in a different way. There was a great article this week in the New York Times by Randy Kennedy that talked about social practice and the efforts of the Queens Museum or CCA, Project Row House in Houston. It really laid out some of these monumental institutions and practices and artists that are working in this process. Pablo Guerra, who, in 2006 was doing the School for Pan-American Unrest, and he now is writing the book that kind of laid down the guidelines for what social practice is, and just said, look, I don't know what it is, but I'm going to lay down the guidelines so that can be debated, and through that we can have a better dialogue of forming that. And I think it was brilliant for him to do that. There was a lot of conversations at that open engagement he was at about the fact that no one wanted to define social practice. We're all doing it, but no one wanted to define it. And at that year's open engagement, a lot of the things that were being presented were not social practice in my mind, in Pablo's mind, and Bill Kelly and I talked about that, and Sarah DeLayden, about the fact that they were just performance taking place in a public setting. Mm-hmm. Difference between that. Performance art has already been defined. And social practice has different variations. It's not just about participation, but it's about, as Tom Finkelpearl said, it's about cooperation. So I think it's evolving because there's more education about it and more awareness of this practice and more acceptance of this practice.
What do you perceive are the main challenges of the field right now?
I think some of the ones that have existed for a little while, funding. How do you fund a project that could be longer term than 3 months? That could be a year, it could be 2 years, 3 years. Very few institutions are doing that right now, and very few foundations are doing that. How do you fund a project where failure is okay? And I think that's one thing that we're really kind of putting in our documentation, that there's a chance of failure and that's okay. And we always believed in that at ASU, that through failure becomes awareness and education and knowledge, and that's just as valid as a successful project. And what do how do you also fund a project that might not be realized? How do you believe in an artist and bring them in residence and say, like, look, if this project isn't realized, that's okay as well, because you can't predict how those relationships and those interactions are going to occur. You can, just set up the best opportunities and the best partnerships and the best collaborations, but there's no guarantees. And I don't think that's not successful. And then a lot of the topics people are talking about what happens, what's the ethics and responsibilities of an artist that goes into a community and makes adjustments or opens up a can of worms that they didn't realize were going to be opened up. I mean, we saw this with Edith Abeyta, best intentions, and his project was really beautiful. But then when you get into city coding issues and you realize by bringing these people in, these architects in to adjust these homes that have been, kind of unpermittedly adjusted previously, when those inspections occur and those adjustments occur, it opens up a can of worms that neither the artist or the community member or, perhaps the foundation or the institution involved really open up, which, that's fair. And then I know there was one other thing I was going to say would be a challenge. I think it's the institutions themselves. How do the institutions recognize social practice and the artists, believe in the artists for the process of social practice, instead of using social practice for the institutional's interest or problem solving? So I'd say that where, we have an issue with bringing in younger audience, or we have an issue with wayfinding, or we have an issue of these spaces that were supposed to be, landscape architect, but we ran out of funding for the landscaping to occur, and now we have this big empty space. So we're bringing a social practice artist, and we'll, do this program in this empty space, which is great because social practice artists need those opportunities. But as well, it's solving a problem for the institution instead of believing in the artists and their vision, saying, we believe in you. What do you want to do? Where do you want to do it? Who do you want to communicate with? Who do you want to collaborate with? Instead of, here's the perimeters of this project. What can you do within our perimeters to help us solve this problem of wayfinding or bringing in an audience, because we don't have a young audience right now. Our audience is aging. And I think there's a lot of responsibility for the institution to step up and say, okay, we believe in this as a medium, just like I'm sure the video artists had to go through this in the early 70s and 80s about how video art is actually an art form and can be shown in a museum or can be collected. And I'm sure, artists way before that were dealing with the same issue. Photography, I'm sure, was the same way.